The stars had never seemed so cold as they did on that terrible night when humanity learned the true face of the galaxy. Admiral Chen Weilin stood on the bridge of the battleship, Eternal Vigilance, and watched her tactical display with growing horror as one by one the Allied fleet signatures began to vanish from the screen. Admiral, the Ryland dreadnoughts are breaking formation. Her tactical officer reported with confusion in his voice. The Veth carriers are retreating to jump gate coordinates. Another officer called out. Chun gripped the railing before her command chair so hard her knuckles turned white because she understood what was happening, even as her mind refused to accept it. For 50 years, humanity had served as a junior member of the Galactic Council, and they had given everything to prove themselves worthy of that honor. They had sent their sons and daughters to fight in wars that were not their own, and they had shared technology and resources freely with species who had traveled the stars for thousands of years before humans had even discovered fire. When the Void Swarm had breached the Orion Arm and threatened to consume everything in its path, the Council had called upon Earth to defend Kepler Station, which was a critical waypoint that protected a dozen inhabited worlds. Humanity had answered that call without hesitation, because that was what allies did for each other. The Third Fleet had assembled at Kepler Station with 17,000 brave souls aboard, 200 warships, and they had trained alongside Ryland warriors and Veth pilots and soldiers from a dozen other species. Admiral Chun had believed they were building something beautiful together as different peoples, united against a common enemy. Now she watched that beautiful lie crumble to dust. All Allied vessels have departed the system, a communications officer said with disbelief thick in her voice. Get me the Council command frequency now. Chun ordered. The channel opened, and she heard voices speaking in languages her translator rendered into words that would haunt her dreams forever. The human fleet will delay the swarm for approximately 6 hours. A cold Ryland voice calculated. Sufficient time for evacuation of priority assets. A Veth commander agreed. Their sacrifice will be noted in the records. Another voice added with no more emotion than if discussing the disposal of broken equipment. Chen felt something break inside her heart, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. This is Admiral Chun Weilin of United Earth Navy, requesting immediate clarification of Allied fleet movements. Silence answered her for a long moment before the Ryland voice returned with what might have been amusement. Your species has served its purpose, Admiral, and the Council thanks you for your contribution to galactic security. You are abandoning us, Chun said flatly. We are ensuring the survival of civilization, the Ryland replied, and your fleet was always intended as a delaying force, to buy time for more valuable assets to withdraw. We trusted you, Chun whispered. A weakness your species will not have time to repeat, the Ryland said before the channel went dead. Chun stood frozen for only a moment before the training of 30 years in the Navy took over and she began issuing orders. All ships form defensive sphere around the station and launch all fighters and prepare for combat. Admiral, the Swarm Vanguard will arrive in 11 minutes, her tactical officer reported. Then we have 11 minutes to make them pay for every second they want to take from us. The battle that followed would be remembered in human history as the Kepler massacre, though the Council would try to bury all evidence that it had ever occurred. The Void Swarm arrived like a tide of darkness, and their bioships numbered in the thousands, while each vessel bristled with organic weapons that could tear through hull plating like paper. The Third Fleet fought with desperate courage, and they destroyed hundreds of swarm vessels in the opening minutes of the engagement. Captain Rodriguez of the destroyer Swift Justice rammed his crippled ship into a swarm carrier. Rather than let his crew be taken alive, Commander Okonkwo led her fighter squadron in a suicidal charge that bought the civilian transports at the station an extra 20 minutes to escape. Ensign Park, barely 20 years old, manually triggered the reactor overload that destroyed 3 swarm cruisers when the automated systems failed. Every human in that battle knew they were going to die, but they refused to die quietly. Admiral Chun directed the defense from the eternal vigilance until a swarm boarding pod breached her hull, and she was forced to pick up a rifle and fight. Alongside her Marines, she killed 17 of the insectoid horrors before a plasma burst took her left arm, and even then she kept fighting with a pistol in her remaining hand until rescue teams dragged her to an escape pod of the 17,000 humans who had answered the Council's call for help. Only 312 survived to limp home in damaged ships that were barely capable of faster-than-light travel. Chun was among them, though she wished many times during the long journey home that she had died with her crew. The survivors brought more than their wounds and their grief back to Earth because they brought recordings of every communication from that terrible day. They brought proof that the Council had planned their deaths from the beginning. They brought evidence that humanity had been nothing more than a sacrificial pawn in a game played by ancient species who viewed them as disposable insects. When the recordings were played before the United Earth Parliament, the chamber fell silent with a horror that no words could express. Billions of humans watched those recordings in their homes, and they wept for the dead, and they raged at the betrayal. Admiral Chun stood before Parliament with her empty sleeve pinned to her uniform, and she spoke words that would echo through history. They call us weak, and they call us expendable, and they left our children to die in the dark between stars. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. They believed we would accept this fate because we are young, and because we are few, and because we do not have the ancient technologies that make them feel like gods. She looked directly into the cameras that broadcast her words to every corner of Earth and every human colony. They were wrong about us. The Parliament voted unanimously to withdraw from the Galactic Council and to cut all diplomatic ties with every species that had participated in the betrayal. But that was only the beginning, because in secret meetings that left no records, the true response was planned. Earth would not simply withdraw and mourn and accept its place as a victim in a cruel galaxy. Earth would remember, and Earth would prepare, and when the time came, Earth would teach the galaxy a lesson about the cost of betraying humanity. Admiral Chun was given command of a project that officially did not exist, and she threw herself into the work with a cold fury that frightened even those who knew her best. We have 3 years, she told her staff, and in 3 years we will have a fleet that will make them understand what they have done. Her officers looked at her with eyes that held the same cold fire that burned in her heart. And what happens in 3 years, Admiral? Her chief of staff asked. Chen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. And those who saw that smile would later say it was the most terrifying thing they had ever witnessed. In 3 years, we stop being victims, and we start being the thing they should have feared from the beginning. The galaxy continued to turn, and the Council powers celebrated their victory over the swarm, which had been pushed back at the cost of a few thousand human lives. They did not notice the silence from Earth because they had already forgotten that humanity existed. That would prove to be a fatal mistake. In hidden shipyards carved into asteroids and buried beneath the ice of distant moons, the hammers of vengeance began to fall, and the forges of war began to burn. Humanity was building something new, and when it was ready, the galaxy would tremble. The dead of Kepler Station would not be forgotten, and their sacrifice would not be in vain. Earth remembered every name, and Earth would make the Council remember them too. The betrayal had been meant to end humanity as a power in the galaxy, but instead it had awakened something that the ancient species had never imagined could exist. It had awakened a fury that would shake the foundations of civilizations that had stood for 10,000 years. The reckoning was coming, and no force in the galaxy would be able to stop it. 3 years passed like a held breath waiting to be released. The Galactic Council barely noticed the silence from Earth, because in their ancient minds humanity had already been written off as a failed experiment and a species that had served its purpose and could now be safely ignored. The Rylan hegemony continued its political games, and the Veth collective expanded its trade networks, and the other council species went about their business as if 17,000 human lives had meant nothing at all. They sent occasional messages to Earth expressing condolences for the losses at Kepler Station, and they even offered to resume diplomatic relations with generous terms that would allow humanity to remain a junior member of their great civilization. Earth never responded to any of these messages. The Council assumed this was because humanity was broken and grieving and too weak to matter anymore. They could not have been more wrong. Beneath the frozen surface of Europa, where no council sensors could penetrate, the largest shipyard in human history worked day and night without rest. The workers there had volunteered, knowing they would not see their families for years, and knowing the work they did would remain secret until the day it was needed. They built with hands that had buried friends and with hearts that burned with a cold fire that never dimmed. Similar facilities existed in asteroid belts and on hidden moons and in deep space stations that appeared on no maps. Admiral Chun toured these facilities regularly, and she watched the new fleet take shape with grim satisfaction. These were not the ships humanity had built during its time in the Council, and they followed none of the regulations and safety protocols that Council membership had required. The Council had always insisted that certain weapons were too dangerous and that certain technologies should be banned for the good of all civilized species. Humanity had obeyed those rules because that was what good allies did. Humanity was no longer anyone's ally. The new ships bristled with weapons that would have made Council inspectors faint in horror. Antimatter warheads that could crack planets sat in magazines that had been designed to hold diplomatic gifts. Railguns that could accelerate projectiles to nearly the speed of light lined the hulls where once there had been only defensive systems. Electronic warfare suites that could blind entire fleets replaced the communication arrays that had been built for friendly coordination. The engineers had been given a simple order from Admiral Chen, which was to build ships that could destroy anything the Council could field, and they had exceeded every expectation. Dr. Sarah Webb was the chief weapons designer, and she presented her latest creation to Admiral Chun in a testing facility deep beneath the lunar surface. "We call it the Sunbreaker," Dr. Webb said with pride in her voice, "and it generates a focused gravity wave that can crush any known material into a sphere the size of a marble." Chen watched a demonstration where a decommissioned frigate was compressed into a tiny ball of metal in less than 3 seconds. "What are the power requirements?" Chen asked. "Enormous," Webb admitted. "But we have solved the reactor problems, and each of our new battleships can fire 3 of these weapons per engagement." Chen nodded slowly as she imagined Council dreadnoughts being crushed like empty cans. "What else do you have for me?" Webb smiled in a way that reminded Chen of a wolf showing its teeth. "The swarm drones are ready for mass production, and they are self-replicating, which means each carrier can deploy millions of them within hours of engagement. The Council banned self-replicating weapons 8,000 years ago." Chen observed. "The Council left our people to die," Webb replied, "and I find I no longer care what the Council banned." This sentiment was universal among the project staff because every single person who worked on the secret fleet had lost someone. At Kepler Station, they were not building weapons of war, but instruments of justice, and they poured their grief into every circuit and every hull plate. By the end of the 3rd year, the first Vengeance fleet was ready. 200 warships sat in formation in the shadow of Europa, and they represented the most concentrated destructive power humanity had ever assembled. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of her new flagship, which had been named Kepler's Memory, and she addressed the fleet through every speaker on every ship. "Today, we begin a mission that will reshape the galaxy," she said, "and I want every one of you to understand what we are about to do. Her voice was steady despite the emotions that churned beneath her calm exterior. For 3 years, we have prepared in secret, and for 3 years we have carried the weight of what was done to us at Kepler Station. She paused to let her words sink in. The Council believed they could sacrifice our people and face no consequences, and they believed we were too weak and too primitive to challenge their ancient power. Her hand touched the wall of her ship in an almost tender gesture. We are going to prove them wrong. The crew of Kepler's memory cheered, and the sound was echoed across every ship in the fleet. Chen raised her hand for silence, and the fleet obeyed instantly. But I also want you to understand what we are not doing. She continued, because we are not monsters seeking blind revenge. She thought of all the innocent beings who lived on Council worlds and who had no part in the decision to betray humanity. We will strike military targets, and we will demand justice from those who ordered our deaths. But we will not slaughter civilians, and we will not become the thing we are fighting against. Her officers nodded with understanding because this had been discussed many times during the preparation. The Council species will learn that humanity cannot be sacrificed without cost, but they will also learn that we are better than them. She straightened her uniform and gave the order that would change galactic history. All ships engage faster than light drives and set course for Ryland space. Admiral, her first officer asked, do we send any warning to the Council about our intentions? Chen smiled that cold smile that her crew had learned to both admire and fear. No warning, and no declaration of war, and no diplomatic niceties. She replied, because they gave us none of those courtesies when they left us to die. The fleet jumped, and 200 ships vanished from the Sol system in a flash of light that no one in the galaxy was watching for it. Ryland hegemony had no idea that death was coming for them across the void. Their border stations detected nothing because human engineers had developed stealth systems that made Council sensors useless. Their spy networks reported nothing because Earth had maintained perfect silence. For 3 years, the first warning the Rylands received was when the first Vengeance fleet dropped out of faster than light travel directly above their fortress world of Thymar. Prime Admiral Chun opened a channel that would be heard across Ryland space, and she spoke 4 words that would become legendary. We remember Kepler Station. Then she gave the order to attack, and the galaxy would never be the same. The fortress of Thymar Prime had stood unconquered for 10,000 years, and it was defended by weapons platforms and shield generators, and a garrison fleet of 50 warships. It fell in 9 hours. Rylands had never faced an enemy like humanity, and their commanders had no experience fighting an opponent who refused to follow the established rules of civilized warfare. Human ships darted and weaved in patterns that made no sense to Ryland tactical computers. Human weapons struck with devastating precision at weak points that Ryland engineers had never imagined could be. Targeted human electronic warfare blinded sensors and scrambled communications and left Ryland admirals commanding fleets they could no longer see or control. When the smoke cleared, Thymar Prime was under human occupation, and the Ryland fleet was debris drifting in the void. Admiral Chun stood in the conquered command center, and she broadcast a message to every corner of the galaxy. The message contained the recordings from Kepler Station and the proof of Council treachery and a simple ultimatum. We are coming for every species that voted to sacrifice our people, Chun announced, and you can surrender your military forces and face a tribunal for your crimes, or you can resist and face annihilation. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look through the camera and into the souls of every Council leader who watched. Choose wisely, because we will only offer this mercy once. The galaxy had awoken a sleeping giant, and that giant was very, very angry. The reckoning had begun, and it would not stop until justice was served. The fall of Thymar Prime sent shockwaves through the Ryland hegemony that their ancient civilization had never experienced before. For 8,000 years, the Rylans had been the dominant military power in the Galactic Council, and their fleets had crushed rebellions and conquered empires and enforced the will of the elder races. Across 1,000 worlds, no enemy had ever taken one of their fortress worlds, and many had believed such a thing was simply impossible. Now, that belief lay shattered. Alongside the wreckage of their border fleet, High Archon Veleth received the news in his throne room on the Rylan homeworld of Relaxis, and his forearms trembled with an emotion his species rarely experienced, which was fear. How is this possible? He demanded of his military advisors, who stood before him with their heads bowed in shame. The humans have developed weapons beyond anything we anticipated, Admiral Karth admitted, and their tactics are unlike any we have trained to counter. They are primitives. Veleth snarled, and they have been part of galactic civilization for only 50 years, while we have ruled the stars for millennia. They are primitives who have spent 3 years doing nothing but preparing to destroy us, Karth replied. And they have succeeded beyond what any of our analysts believe possible. Veleth slammed his fist against his throne, and the sound echoed through the chamber. Then we will crush them with numbers, because even if their ships are powerful, they cannot stand against the full might of the hegemony. He began issuing orders that would strip defenses from 12 worlds and concentrate every available warship for a counterattack. Meanwhile, Admiral Chun was advancing deeper into Rylan space, with a strategy that Council military theorists would study for centuries afterward. She did not move in the straight lines and predictable formations that characterize Council warfare, because she had learned to fight in a completely different school. Human military history was filled with examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones through mobility and deception and sheer ruthless creativity. Chun applied every lesson from Earth's bloody past to the war against the hegemony. Her fleet would appear at one system and destroy the military infrastructure there before vanishing into faster than light travel. By the time Rylan reinforcements arrived, the humans were already gone and attacking somewhere else entirely. The Raylans called this cowardice, but Chun called it efficiency. We do not have the numbers for a stand-up fight with their combined fleets, she explained to her officers, so we will never give them a stand-up fight. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander David Okonkwo, who was the son of the pilot who had died at Kepler Station, nodded with understanding. We bleed them one cut at a time, he said. Exactly, Chun agreed. And we make every engagement so costly that they begin to question whether fighting us is worth the price. The strategy worked with devastating effectiveness. In the first month of the campaign, the humans destroyed 47 Rylan warships and 18 orbital defense stations and 4 major shipyards. The Rylans destroyed exactly 0 human vessels. This was partly due to human technology, but mostly due to human tactics that the Rylans simply could not adapt to quickly enough. When Rylan ships formed defensive formations, the humans would strike from multiple directions at once, using missiles that could navigate around shields. When Rylan ships pursued aggressively, the humans would lead them into ambushes, where gravity weapons would crush them before they could fire a shot. When Rylan commanders tried to protect everything at once, they spread their forces too thin, and the humans would concentrate overwhelming firepower against isolated targets. Admiral Karth grew increasingly desperate as his losses mounted, and his political enemies at court began to whisper that he was unfit for command. He proposed a new strategy to the High Archon, which was to fortify the homeworld and let the humans waste themselves against its ancient defenses. Veleth rejected this plan because it would mean abandoning dozens of colonies to human occupation, and the political cost would be too great. Attack them, Veleth ordered, and find their fleet and destroy it, and I do not care how many ships it costs. Karth obeyed, because disobeying the High Archon meant death. He assembled a fleet of 200 warships, which was the largest Rylan force gathered in one place since the last Great War against the Swarm intelligence. Reports suggested the human fleet was operating near the Varus system, so Karth took his armada there at maximum speed. He found nothing but empty space while he searched for enemies who were not there. Admiral Chun led her fleet directly to Relaxis itself. The homeworld's defenses were formidable, but they had been designed to work in coordination with the main fleet, which was now on the other side of Ryland's space gen. Struck at midnight local time, when the world's population was sleeping, her ships emerged from faster-than-light travel so close to the planet that Ryland's sensors barely had time to register their presence before the attack began. Human missiles screamed toward military installations and defense platforms and government buildings. Ryland interceptors launched to meet them, but human electronic warfare systems confused their targeting computers and sent them spiraling into empty space. The planetary shields held for nearly an hour, which was long enough for millions of Rylands to wake and watch the sky burn with the light of battle. Then Dr. Webb's gravity weapons came into play, and the shield generators were crushed into twisted metal, and the shields fell. Admiral Chun could have destroyed the planet then, but she remembered her promise to her crew. Target only military and government installations, she ordered, and spare civilian areas. Her ships obeyed, and precision strikes eliminated the hegemony's military command structure while leaving residential zones untouched. High Archon Velith fled to a bunker deep beneath his palace, but human ground forces found him within hours. He was taken alive and brought before Admiral Chun in chains. "You cannot do this," he sputtered, "because I am the High Archon, and I am protected by galactic law." Chun looked at him with eyes that held no mercy. "Galactic law," she repeated. "And you speak to me of galactic law after what your people did at Kepler Station?" She held up a datapad showing the recordings of Council communications from that terrible day. "This is your voice authorizing the abandonment of our fleet, and this is your signature on the orders that left 17,000 humans to die." Velith had no response. "You will face a tribunal for your crimes," Chun told him, "and the families of those you murdered will hear testimony and see evidence and watch as justice is finally served." She turned to her Marines. "Take him to the brig and treat him humanely, because we are not savages despite what his propaganda says about us." News of Relaxis's fall spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Ryland hegemony, which had dominated council politics for millennia, had been brought to its knees in less than 2 months. Admiral Karth returned from his futile chase to find his homeworld occupied and his Archon in human custody. Was given the choice of surrender or death, and chose surrender because dying would not help his people. The terms of Ryland capitulation were harsh, but not genocidal. All military vessels would be surrendered, and all leaders who had participated in the Kepler decision would face trial. Civilian population would be protected, and the world would eventually be returned to self-governance once justice had been served. Many Rylands expected extermination, because that was what they would have done to a defeated enemy. When it did not come, they did not know how to respond. Admiral Chun addressed the conquered population in a broadcast that was also heard across council space. "We did not come here seeking revenge for its own sake," she said, "because we came seeking justice and accountability for a terrible crime." Her voice hardened. "But let this be a lesson to every species in the galaxy. And if you betray humanity, and if you sacrifice our people, and if you treat us as expendable pawns, then you will answer for it." She looked into the camera with eyes that had seen too much death. "We are not weak, and we are not primitive, and we will never be victims again." The message was heard, and the galaxy trembled. The Ryland hegemony had fallen, and the other council powers knew they were next. The fall of the Ryland hegemony created a panic among the remaining council powers that had not been seen in 10,000 years of galactic history. Emergency sessions were held on a dozen worlds as leaders who had grown complacent in their ancient power suddenly realized that the young species they had dismissed as insignificant might actually destroy them. The Veth Collective, which controlled the largest trade networks in the galaxy, saw its commerce freeze as merchants refused to travel. Through space that might become a war zone, Irani, empire with its crystalline spires and psychic aristocracy, mobilized armies that had not marched in centuries. The Silicate, minds which were ancient machine intelligences that had achieved sentience, before most species had evolved, began running probability calculations that produced deeply troubling results. Even the shepherds, who were the most ancient and mysterious of the council races, emerged from their isolation to participate in discussions about what was to be done. The humans must be stopped, declared Prime Minister Vedax of the Collective in a broadcast to the other council powers. Because if they are allowed to continue this rampage, then none of us will be safe. We agree, the Irani Emperor responded. But the Rylans were the strongest military power among us, and they fell in weeks. Then we must combine our strength, Vethax argued, because separately we may fall, but together we will outnumber the humans by a factor of 20 to 1. The proposal was debated fiercely because the council species had spent millennia competing with each other, and the idea of genuine cooperation was foreign to many of them. But fear proved to be an effective motivator. Within a month, a coalition had formed that brought together fleets from every major council power. 8,000 warships gathered at the Crimson Nebula, which was a strategically vital region that controlled access to multiple trade routes and jump gates. The coalition commanders believed they had set the perfect trap. Intelligence suggested that humanity's second vengeance fleet, which had been launched from Earth 6 months after the first, was advancing toward the nebula. The Buladi coalition would let them enter and then close the trap from all sides with overwhelming numbers. Even if each human ship can destroy 10 of ours, we will still have ships remaining when they are all dead. Admiral Lessig of the Veth calculated. The mathematics seemed sound. They were not. Admiral James Okonkwo commanded the Second Vengeance fleet, and he inherited his mother's courage along with her tactical genius when his scouts reported the massive enemy concentration at the Crimson Nebula. He did not turn back or call for reinforcements. Instead, he smiled. They want us to come to them, he told his officers, so we will give them exactly what they want, but not in the way they expect. The Second Fleet entered the nebula exactly where coalition intelligence predicted, and the trap closed behind them with 8,000 ships moving to surround 200 human vessels. Admiral Besic watched his tactical display with satisfaction as the human fleet was encircled. All ships hold position and wait for my order to engage, he commanded. He wanted the humans to see how badly they were outnumbered and hoped they might surrender rather than force a battle that could only end in their destruction. Human Commander, Desig broadcast, you are surrounded by forces that outnumber you 40 to 1 and your situation is hopeless, so I offer you the opportunity to surrender and spare your crews. Admiral Okonkwo's response came with a tone of amusement that puzzled the coalition commander. I appreciate the offer, but I must decline because you see we have been waiting for you to gather in one place like this. Before Desig could ask what he meant, the human fleet began deploying weapons that the coalition had never seen before. Thousands of tiny objects launched from human carriers and began multiplying as they flew. What are those? Desig demanded. Unknown contacts multiplying exponentially, his tactical officer reported with growing alarm. And they appear to be self-replicating attack drones. The Council had banned self-replicating weapons 8,000 years ago after a war that had nearly destroyed a dozen worlds. The ban had been so effective that most species had forgotten such weapons were even possible now. They remembered. Within minutes, there were millions of drones swarming through the coalition formation, and each one was armed with a small explosive charge that could cripple a larger ship. Coalition point defense systems had been designed to handle hundreds of incoming projectiles. Not million ships began dying as drones found weak points in their armor and detonated against critical systems. The formation that had seemed so overwhelming began to dissolve into chaos then. The gravity weapons fired. Dr. Webb had designed a new variant for fleet engagements that created a wave of distorted space sweeping through enemy formations. Coalition ships caught in the wave were crushed or torn apart as their structural integrity failed against forces their hulls were never meant to withstand. Thasek watched in horror as a third of his fleet was destroyed in the opening minutes of the engagement. All ships concentrate fire on the human vessels. He screamed, but the drones were everywhere now and targeting systems could not lock onto the human ships. Through the interference, coalition ships began firing wildly. As many of them hit each other as hit the enemy. Admiral Okonkwo pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. His ships moved through the chaos like predators through a herd of panicked prey, and each strike destroyed another coalition vessel, while the drones kept multiplying and spreading destruction. Thasek tried to rally his remaining forces, but communication channels were jammed, and his fleet had become a disorganized mob fighting for survival rather than victory. After 4 hours of battle, the coalition had lost half its ships and the survivors were fleeing in every direction. The human fleet had lost 7 vessels. Okonkwo did not pursue because his mission was not extermination, and he had already achieved his objective of breaking the coalition as a fighting force. He broadcast a message to the retreating ships. Tell your governments what happened here, and tell them that humanity offers the same terms we offered the Rylans, which is surrender of military forces and trial for those responsible for Kepler Station. His voice hardened. If you choose to resist further, then what happened today will happen again and again until you have no ships left to fight with. The survivors carried his message back to their homeworlds, and the story of the Battle of the Crimson Nebula spread across the galaxy. 8,000 ships had faced 200 and the 8,000 had been routed. The mathematics of the situation no longer seemed so favorable to the favors had been routed. The mathematics of the situation no longer seemed so favorable to the council powers. Emergency meetings dissolved into recriminations as species blamed each other for the disaster. The Veth accused the Irani of breaking formation too soon, while the Irani accused the Veth of failing to provide proper intelligence. The Silicate minds withdrew from the coalition entirely after calculating that continued resistance had only a 3% chance of success. Smaller species that had contributed forces to the coalition began sending secret messages to humanity asking for terms. The great alliance that had been assembled to destroy the human threat was falling apart. Before it had even recovered from its first defeat, Admiral Chun received reports of the victory with grim satisfaction. But she knew the war was not over yet. The Shepherds have not committed any forces, she told her staff, and they are the oldest and most powerful of the council races. Do you think they will fight? Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo asked. Chen considered the question carefully. I do not know, but we should prepare for the possibility, because the Shepherds have been manipulating galactic politics for longer than any other species has existed. She looked at the star map, showing the disposition of human forces across council space. They are planning something, and I want to know what it is before it surprises us. The search for answers would lead humanity down a path that would reveal secrets the galaxy had hidden for 10,000 years. The Coalition's defeat at the Crimson Nebula changed the nature of the war. What had begun as a campaign of human vengeance transformed into something larger as the ancient order that had governed the galaxy for millennia began to crack and crumble. Admiral Chun divided her forces into multiple task groups, each with its own mission and its own targets. The Rani Empire was the next to face judgment. Their crystalline homeworld of Aranos had been the center of a psychic aristocracy that had ruled over dozens of subject species for 8,000 years. The Rani considered themselves the most cultured and sophisticated beings in the galaxy, and they looked down on every other species. including their fellow council members when human ships appeared. In their system, they responded with contempt, primitive creatures. The Orani Emperor broadcast, "You may have defeated the brutish Rylands and scattered the merchant Veth, but you have not faced a civilization of true power." He raised his hands, and the psychic energy of 1 billion Orani minds focused through ancient amplifiers built into the planet's crust. Wave of mental force was meant to overwhelm human minds and leave the fleet helpless. Admiral Chun felt the attack as a pressure behind her eyes, and she heard screams from some of her crew as the psychic assault tried to break their will, but humanity had prepared for this possibility. Dr. Webb's team had developed neural shielding based on technology salvaged from Ryland defeats, and every human soldier and sailor wore devices that blunted psychic attacks. The Emperor's weapon, which had shattered the minds of rebel armies for millennia, accomplished nothing more than giving the human crews mild headaches. "Is that the best you can do?" Chun broadcast back. The Emperor's confidence shattered as he realized his greatest weapon was useless. "Attack them," he screamed at his admirals. "Destroy them with conventional weapons." But the Orani had relied on their psychic abilities for so long that their conventional military had atrophied. Their ships were beautiful but fragile, and their tactics were designed to support psychic warfare, not to function without. Human weapons tore through crystalline hulls with ease. The Rani fleet was destroyed in hours, and the Emperor was captured when Marines breached his palace. Unlike the Rylan Archon, he did not survive to face trial because he chose to end his own life rather than submit to beings he considered inferior. His death did not slow the collapse of his empire subject species that had been held in bondage by Orani. Psychic control suddenly found their chains broken. Rebellions erupted across Orani space as peoples who had been slaves for generations rose up against their former masters. Human occupying forces found themselves greeted as liberators rather than conquerors in system after system. This pattern repeated across the galaxy. The silicate minds had calculated that resistance was futile, but they believed their nature as machine intelligences would protect them from human vengeance. They were mistaken. Human AI specialists had been studying silicate mind architecture since the days of council cooperation, and they had developed weapons specifically designed to attack machine consciousness. A virus uploaded through captured communication nodes spread through the vast silicate network, causing disruptions that the ancient machines had never experienced. It did not destroy them, but it made them vulnerable. And when human ships arrived, the silicates had no choice but to negotiate. The terms were harsh because the silicates had been among the most vocal supporters of sacrificing humanity at Kepler Station. Their calculation that human lives were worth less than the effort of mounting a proper defense had been recorded and broadcast across the galaxy. Now they were forced to surrender their military assets and submit to having their decision-making processes monitored by human observers who would ensure they never again treated organic lives as expendable variables. The Veth collective collapsed from within. Their society had been built on commerce and trade, and the war had destroyed the networks that sustained them. When their government fell apart, a new leadership emerged that was willing to accept human terms in exchange for peace. One by one, the powers that had participated in the betrayal faced judgment, but humanity's conduct during the conquests surprised many observers. Civilian populations were not harmed, and infrastructure was preserved, and occupied worlds were administered with a fairness that many had never experienced from their own governments. Chun had given strict orders that were enforced ruthlessly. "We are not here to destroy civilizations, but to hold them accountable for their crimes, and if we become monsters in the process, then the dead of Kepler Station died for nothing." Our officers understood, and they ensured that human forces behaved with discipline. And restraint word spread among the younger species of the galaxy about how the humans treated conquered populations. These were peoples who had been denied council membership and exploited by the elder races for millennia. They had watched the war with a mixture of hope and fear, and now they began to see humanity not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Secret communications reached Earth from dozens of worlds, offers of alliance and intelligence about council movements and requests for assistance against local oppressors flooded human diplomatic channels. Chun established a network of contacts among these species, and their information proved invaluable. It was through one of these contacts that humanity learned the truth about the shepherds. Scholar from a minor species called the Keleth approached human intelligence officers with beta files that had been stolen from shepherd archives centuries ago. My people have kept these secrets for generations, waiting for someone strong enough to use them. The scholar explained. Files contained information that would change humanity's understanding of the galaxy. The shepherds were not simply another ancient species, but the architects of the current galactic order. They had manipulated events for 10,000 years to maintain their power and ensure that no other species could challenge their dominance. The council had been their tool, and the other elder races had been their puppets, and every war and every treaty had served shepherd interests. Most disturbing was the information about the Void Swarm. The files suggested that the swarm was not a natural phenomenon at all, but something far more troubling. Admiral Chun read the reports with growing alarm, and she knew that this information would need to be verified before any action could be taken. But if it was true, then the war humanity was fighting was only a small part of a much larger game. We need to get into the shepherd archives, she told her intelligence chief, because if these files are accurate, then everything we think we know about the galaxy is a lie. The campaign against the shepherds would require a different approach than the straightforward military operations that had defeated the other council powers. The shepherds were ancient and cunning, and they had been manipulating events since before humanity existed. Defeating them would require humanity to be even more cunning. Chun began planning the most complex operation of the war. The stakes were no longer simply justice for Kepler Station, but the truth about the galaxy itself and in the shadows. The shepherds watched and prepared their own countermeasures. They had manipulated younger species for 10,000 years, and they were not about to let upstart humans disrupt their plans. The final confrontation was approaching, and its outcome would determine the fate of every sentient being in the galaxy. The remaining council powers retreated to the galactic core, where the ancient station that had served as the seat of council authority for 12,000 years orbited a dying star. The Veth remnants and the Tarani fleet and the enigmatic shepherds gathered their surviving forces around this fortress, and they prepared to make their final stand. For weeks, human scouts probed the defenses and reported back with growing concern. The core station was protected by weapons and shields far beyond anything humanity had encountered. Energy signatures suggested technologies that predated the current council by thousands of years. This is the precursor arsenal, Admiral Chun's intelligence officer reported, and according to recovered records, these are weapons left behind by a civilization that ruled the galaxy before any current species evolved. Chun studied the data with a frown. How did the council acquire such weapons? The shepherds discovered them 10,000 years ago, and they have maintained them ever since, but they have never used them in any recorded conflict. This fact troubled Chun more than the weapons themselves. If the shepherds had possessed planet-killing technology for millennia, why had they never deployed it against the Void Swarm or any other threat? The answer came in the form of a broadcast from the core station. A shepherd appeared on every communication channel in the galaxy, and for the first time humanity saw one of the ancient beings clearly. The shepherd resembled a tall, thin humanoid wrapped in robes of shifting light with features that seemed to blur and change when viewed directly. Humanity. The shepherd spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from across vast distances. You have proven yourselves more formidable than we anticipated. Chun responded from her flagship. We have come for justice, and you have been behind everything from the beginning. The shepherd inclined its head in acknowledgement. We have guided galactic civilization for 10,000 years, and every decision we have made has been for the greater good of all species, including the decision to sacrifice 17,000 humans at Kepler Station, a regrettable necessity. The shepherd replied without any sign of remorse, because the defense of the station required resources that were needed elsewhere, and the loss of one species' soldiers was preferable to the loss of multiple worlds. We are not expendable. Chun said flatly. All species are expendable when measured against the survival of civilization itself. The shepherd responded. And this is a truth that young species do not understand until they have watched empires rise and fall for thousands of years. The shepherd raised one elongated hand and gestured at something beyond the camera. But enough philosophy, because we have allowed you to wage your war of vengeance against the lesser powers of the Council. But your advance ends here. Is that so? The precursor arsenal has been activated, the shepherd announced. And the weapons before you can destroy planets and extinguish stars and reduce entire fleets to atoms in seconds. The tactical displays on every human ship updated with new readings as energy signatures spiked around the core station. If you do not withdraw to your home system immediately, we will be forced to use these weapons and your species will cease to exist. Chun felt ice in her stomach as she reviewed the data. The readings were real and the weapons were operational, and a single shot from the largest platform could indeed destroy a planet. You would commit genocide to stop us? She asked. We would do what is necessary to preserve galactic order, the shepherd replied, as we have always done. For the first time since leaving Earth, Admiral Chun did not know what to do. Her fleet could not survive against weapons of this magnitude, and she could not order her people to die in a hopeless attack. But she also could not simply accept defeat and allow the beings who had murdered her friends to escape justice. She asked for time to consider the ultimatum, and the shepherds granted her 24 hours. The fleet retreated to a safe distance, and Chun gathered her senior officers for a council of war. We cannot fight those weapons, Admiral Okonkwo admitted, because even our most advanced technology cannot survive a direct hit from a star killer. Then we have to find another way. Chun said. Her intelligence chief cleared his throat. Admiral, there is something that has been bothering me about this situation. Go on. The shepherds have had these weapons for 10,000 years, but they have never used them, and not against the swarm or the various rebellions or any of the conflicts that have threatened galactic stability. Chun nodded slowly as she followed his logic. You are suggesting there is a reason they have never fired these weapons. I am suggesting we need to find out what that reason is before we make any decisions. The search for answers led Chun to review every piece of intelligence humanity had gathered during the war. The files from the Kalaskar, the captured Orani archives, the data recovered from silicate mine networks. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge that was far more disturbing than anything Chun had imagined. The Void Swarm was not a random cosmic threat, but a response mechanism. Precursor civilization that had built the arsenal had also encountered something terrible in the void between galaxies, and they had created the swarm as a quarantine measure. If the arsenal was activated, the swarm would be drawn to its energy signature. Using the weapons would save the galaxy from humanity, but condemn it to destruction by the very threat the Council had been fighting for millennia. The shepherds knew this, which was why they had never used the arsenal. Their ultimatum was a bluff built on weapons. They could not actually fire. Chun laughed when she understood the truth. They have been bluffing the entire galaxy for 10,000 years, she said, and every species has been terrified of weapons that were never a real threat. But Admiral, how do we prove this? Our tactical officer asked. Chen smiled. We do not need to prove it because we just need to call their bluff, she ordered. the fleet to advance toward the core station. The shepherds broadcast increasingly desperate warnings, but Chun did not stop. When human ships entered range of the arsenal platforms, nothing happened. No weapons fired, and no planets were destroyed, and the shepherds' threats proved as hollow as Chun had suspected. All ships engaged defensive targets only. Chun ordered, and prepare for boarding operations on the core station. The battle for the core station was fierce but brief. Shepherd warriors were formidable opponents who had been bred for combat over thousands of generations, but they had never faced an enemy who was not afraid of them. Human marines fought with the fury of people who had been lied to and manipulated and watched their friends die for those lies. When it was over, Admiral Chun stood in the central chamber of the core station. This last shepherd elders were bound before her, and for the first time in 10,000 years, they were the ones who felt fear. "Your reign is over," Chun told them, "and the galaxy will know the truth about everything you have done. You do not understand," one elder whispered. "And if you destroy us, then who will guide the younger species?" Chun looked at the ancient being with contempt. "You never guided anyone, but only manipulated and exploited and sacrificed as you saw fit." She turned to her communications officer. "Broadcast everything and send the truth to every world in the galaxy. The secrets the shepherds had hidden for millennia were about to be revealed, and the galaxy would never be the same." The broadcast reached every inhabited world in the galaxy within hours, and what it revealed shattered 10,000 years of carefully constructed lies. Admiral Chun stood before a camera in the captured council chamber, while behind her the bound shepherd elders watched with expressions of ancient despair. "Citizens of the galaxy," Chun began, "you have been told that the Void Swarm is a natural disaster, and that the Council exists to protect all species, and that they, shepherds, are wise guardians who have guided civilization for millennia." She paused to let her words sink. "And everything you have been told is a lie." The broadcast showed documents recovered from Shepherd archives, with translations in every major galactic language. The Void Swarm is not a natural phenomenon, but a defense mechanism created by the Precursor civilization that ruled this galaxy before any current species existed. Images appeared showing ancient records, written in a language that predated known history. The Precursors encountered something in the void between galaxies, and something so terrible that they created the swarm to prevent it from spreading. Chun's voice hardened. The swarm attacks any civilization that develops certain technologies, because those technologies would attract the attention of what the Precursors called the true enemy. The shepherds discovered this truth 10,000 years ago, when they found the Precursor archives, and rather than share this knowledge, they chose to exploit it. She gestured at the elders behind her. They positioned themselves as protectors against the swarm, while secretly manipulating every other species to ensure their own dominance. The broadcast continued with more evidence. Records showed how the shepherds had deliberately sparked conflicts between rising species to prevent any from becoming powerful enough to challenge them. They had controlled access to technology and suppressed discoveries that might have helped defeat the swarm permanently. They had sacrificed entire civilizations when it suited their purposes, always claiming it was for the greater good. The decision to abandon humanity at Kepler Station was not made by the Rylan hegemony alone, Chun announced, but was orchestrated by the shepherds, who saw an opportunity to eliminate a young species that was growing too quickly and asking too many questions. This revelation caused the greatest shock the Rylans and Veth and other council species had believed they were making their own decisions when they betrayed humanity. Now they learned they had been puppets dancing on shepherd strings. The Precursor arsenal that the shepherds threatened us with cannot actually be used, Chun continued, because firing it would draw the swarm to this region of space and doom every world within 1,000 light years. She held up a data tablet. This is all documented in their own archives, and they have been bluffing the galaxy for 10 millennia with weapons they could never use. The response to the broadcast was immediate and overwhelming on 100 worlds' populations that had lived in fear of the Council took to the streets. Species that had been enemies for centuries found common cause in their anger at having been manipulated. The Rylans and Veth and Irani, who had been conquered by humanity, now directed their rage at the shepherds, who had used them as pawns. Even the silicate minds, who were supposed to be emotionless machines, broadcast messages expressing something very close to fury. We calculated that betraying humanity was optimal based on data the shepherds provided. One mind network announced, and we were manipulated into becoming instruments of their agenda. Former council powers that had been preparing to resist human occupation suddenly changed their stance. Ambassadors arrived at human-controlled worlds, asking not for terms of surrender, but for alliance against the true enemy. We were fools to follow the shepherds, the new Rylan leadership admitted, and we ask humanity's forgiveness for our role in the tragedy. At Kepler Station, Admiral Chun watched the chaos with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Truth had done more damage to the old order than all of humanity's weapons combined, but it had also created a power vacuum that could lead to even greater conflict. She met with representatives of the former council species and the younger races who had been denied membership. The old system is broken, she told them, and we need to build something new. What do you propose? The Rylan ambassador asked. A true alliance where no species is considered junior or senior, and where decisions are made collectively, and where no one group can manipulate the others for their own benefit. Such a system has never existed in galactic history, an Irani diplomat pointed out. Then we will be the first to create it. The negotiations were long and difficult because species that had been enemies for centuries did not easily learn to trust each other. But the truth about the shepherds had changed everything. When beings realized they had all been victims of the same manipulation, they found it easier to set aside old grievances. Younger races who had been oppressed by the council were especially eager to participate in the new order. They brought perspectives and ideas that the elder species had ignored for millennia. Human diplomats served as mediators in disputes because, ironically, the species that had nearly been exterminated was now trusted more than any other. You have proven that you fight only when justice demands it, a Calith representative explained, and you have shown mercy to those you defeated. The tribunals for war criminals began as the new alliance took shape. Shepherd elders who had made the decisions that led to Kepler Station and 1,000 other atrocities faced judgment. Rylan and Veth officials who had participated in the betrayal were also tried, though many received lighter sentences when they proved they had acted under shepherd manipulation. Admiral Chun refused to allow any death sentences. We are not executioners, she insisted, and those responsible will live long lives in prison contemplating what they have done. As the trials concluded and the new alliance solidified, humanity found itself in a position no one had ever anticipated. The species that had been sacrificed as expendable 3 years ago was now at the heart of a galactic transformation. But the work was far from done. Void swarms still existed, and the true enemy still lurked in the void between galaxies. The galaxy needed to prepare for threats far greater than anything the Council had ever faced. Admiral Chun knew that humanity's war of vengeance had only been the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, and this time the galaxy would face them together. 5 years after the fall of the Shepherd regime, the galaxy gathered to witness something unprecedented in its long history. On a station newly constructed in neutral space, representatives of 237 species assembled to sign the Charter of the Galactic Compact. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin stood at the center of the Great Hall wearing a dress uniform that bore the ribbons of a dozen campaigns. Left arm was still missing because she had refused a prosthetic that doctors had offered, and she said the empty sleeve reminded her of what the old order had cost. The species represented in that hall ranged from the ancient Rylans and Veth, who had once ruled the council, to young civilizations that had only achieved space flight within the last century. All stood as equals, which was something the galaxy had never seen before. When I led the fleet from Earth 5 years ago, Chun said to the assembled delegates, I did not imagine I would one day stand here speaking to you as allies. She looked around the chamber at faces and forms that no longer seemed alien. I came for vengeance because the beings I trusted had betrayed my people and left 17,000 humans to die in the dark between stars. Her voice was steady despite the memories that still haunted her. We destroyed fleets and conquered worlds and broke the power of species that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. She paused, and I've asked myself many times whether it was worth it. The hall was silent as every being waited to hear her answer. The dead of Kepler Station cannot be brought back, and the families who lost husbands and wives and children still grieve, and no amount of justice can truly heal those wounds. Chum straightened her shoulders. But something has emerged from that tragedy that gives me hope, and that is all of you. She gestured at the assembled delegates. You were enemies, and you were victims, and you were oppressors, and you were slaves. But today you stand together as equals. The old order was built on lies and manipulation, and the assumption that some lives were worth more than others. Her eyes hardened. We have proven that assumption wrong, and every species here has a voice, and every species here has value. And no one will ever again be sacrificed because someone decided they were expendable. A Rylan delegate rose to speak, Admiral Chun the Rylan. People wish to formally apologize for our role in the tragedy at Kepler Station. His voice was thick with emotion. We were manipulated by the shepherds, but that does not excuse our actions, and we know that words alone cannot repair what was broken. He bowed deeply. We offer humanity our friendship and our loyalty and our promise that we will never again treat any species as lesser beings. Similar statements followed from other former council species. The Veth pledged to rebuild their trade networks in ways that benefited all, rather than exploiting the weak. The Rani renounced their psychic domination forever and offered to share their mental sciences for the benefit of all. Even the silicate minds expressed what their emotionless language called optimal appreciation for the new order. When the speeches concluded, Chun was asked to sign the charter, first as representative of the species that had made it all possible. She hesitated before taking the stylus. I am a soldier, and I have spent 5 years fighting a war that I never wanted. She looked at the document before her. I do not know if I am the right person to sign for humanity, because this charter represents peace and cooperation and hope for a future that warriors like me struggled to imagine. A young human diplomat stepped forward. She was Lieutenant Maya Park, the niece of the Ensign Park, who had died at Kepler Station, triggering the reactor overload that had destroyed 3 swarm cruisers. Admiral, with respect. This is exactly why you should sign. Chung raised an eyebrow. Explain. You could have destroyed every species that wronged us, and you had the power, and frankly, you had the right after what they did. Maya gestured at the assembled delegates. But instead, you showed mercy, and you demanded justice rather than revenge, and you built alliances with former enemies. Her voice strengthened. That is not the action of a warrior who only knows how to fight, but of a leader who understands when to stop fighting. Chun considered the young woman's words. She thought of all the battles she had fought and all the lives she had taken and all the lives she had saved. She thought of the 17,000 who had died at Kepler Station and who would never see the new galaxy their deaths had helped create. Finally, she took the stylus and signed her name. For the dead of Kepler Station, she said quietly, and for all those who will live in the galaxy we build from here. The Charter of the Galactic Compact was adopted unanimously. In the months that followed, The new order began to take shape. Research stations were established to study the void swarm and seek ways to address the threat without endless sacrifice. The precursor archives were open to all species, and scientists from across the galaxy worked together to understand the technologies that had been hidden for so long. Former enemies built joint defense fleets that patrolled shared borders, not to threaten each other but to protect against external threats. Humanity found its place not as a dominant power, but as a respected voice among many. Chan declined every offer of political leadership that was extended to her. "I am a soldier," she insisted, "and my war is over." She retired to Earth, where monuments had been built bearing the names of everyone who had died at Kepler Station. Every year on the anniversary of the betrayal, she visited those monuments and spent the day in quiet reflection. Young officers sometimes sought her out to ask questions about the war or to request advice for their own careers. One such officer, a newly commissioned ensign, found her sitting before the memorial wall as the sun set. "Admiral," he asked nervously, "do you think the war was worth it?" Chun looked at the names etched in stone, and she remembered the faces of friends she would never see again. "Ask me in 1,000 years," she replied, "because we are only getting started." The ensign looked confused. "What do you mean?" Chun gestured at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "We spent 50 years as junior members of a corrupt order that considered us expendable, and then we spent 5 years at war. That is nothing in the span of galactic history." She stood and faced a young officer. "The compact we signed is a beginning and not an ending, and the galaxy still faces threats that we barely understand. But for the first time in 10,000 years, every species faces those threats together. And that is something worth fighting for." The ensign nodded slowly as understanding dawned. So the war was worth it. Chun smiled, and for the first time in years there was warmth in it. The war taught the galaxy that humanity cannot be ignored or sacrificed or pushed aside, and that was a lesson that needed to be learned. She looked back at the memorial one last time. But the peace is what truly matters now, because it is what we do with that peace that will determine whether those who died gave their lives for something lasting. She walked away from the memorial as the stars emerged fully overhead. The galaxy stretched above her, infinite and mysterious and filled with possibilities. Humanity had claimed its place among those stars through fire and blood and determination. Now came the harder work of building a future worthy of those who had fallen. Admiral Chen Weilin had led her people through their darkest hour and into a new dawn. What came next would be written by those who followed, and they would remember Kepler Station not as a tragedy, but as the moment when humanity refused to be broken. The moment when the galaxy learned that underestimating humans was the gravest mistake any civilization could make. The betrayal had been meant to end humanity. Instead, it had transformed them into something the ancient powers had never imagined. Species that could shake the foundations of empires and still choose mercy over vengeance. Species that could wage war across the stars and still believe in building a better future. A species that would never forget its dead, but would honor them by creating something worth living. For the galaxy had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had just begun to stretch its wings.